Welcome to this Fusion e-learning module focused on animation. First, it's important to note that in Fusion, there are two types of animation. Presentation animations, which we'll be working on together, and complex mechanical motion animations, for which you'll need to use the joint and motion study feeders within the assembly functions. So, for presentation animations, we'll start by switching modes and selecting the animation mode. You'll see a new interface with a new toolbar and a blank timeline. In my case, the timeline isn't blank because this is the animation we'll be working on together, which I can demonstrate using the playback controls here to preview your animation. We'll be creating camera movements, pop movements, and part appearances. But before we start, let's get on the same page. I'll create a new blank storyboard by going to the toolbar, clicking on Storyboard, and then selecting New Storyboard. This allows us to create multiple storyboards or videos, which can either be independent or linked together. I can choose to start my new storyboard from the end of the previous one or create a completely new one. For now, I'll create a blank one so that my interface matches yours. Before we begin, it's important to understand how the timeline works. When the cursor is on the timeline and you apply a transformation or camera movement, it will automatically record it. This can be problematic because as you work on your object, you'll make various camera movements and they will all be recorded. To avoid this, you can go to the toolbar and click on the View button, which will pause the recording of your camera movements, allowing you to work without interruptions. The other key point is that when the cursor is no longer on the timeline, but on the red curtain, it doesn't record transformations, but instead records the initial states. For example, at the beginning of our video, the orange bars here are not visible, so I'll hide them. To do this, I can either select an object, find it in my browser, and use the eye icon as in the design phase, or I can select it, go to the transform menu, and use the show hide function, which we'll also use later to make it reappear. The other parts that are in a different state are the gear here and the two connecting parts. They don't start on the assembly, but outside the table. So we'll move them while still on the red curtain. We'll go to the transform menu and use the transform components function. Here I won't move everything at once. I'll just move the gear along the z-axis by 600 units. Make sure to remember these values. They'll be useful when we place it back in position. Next, I'll apply another transformation to the connecting parts, this time moving them by minus 500 units. Notice that the orientation of these parts and the gear are different since one moves in the positive direction and the other in the negative. This difference might be useful later. Now that I've set the different elements to their initial states, we can start working on them, beginning with creating the movement of these parts to bring them back to the assembly. I'll move the cursor on the timeline to the 2-second mark. I'll select the gear and apply a transformation with the inverse value we used earlier, which is minus 600. Once I hit OK, a timeline bar for this movement will appear in the animation timeline. And I'll repeat the same steps for the two connecting parts, this time using a value of 500. Now I have 3 movements happening simultaneously. I can later modify, organize, or adjust the timing by extending or shortening them. But before doing that, we'll set up the camera movement. For the camera, I'll start by moving the cursor to the red curtain. I'll reactivate the camera recording, which will return to the original position I had. Still on the red curtain, I'll set the initial position, which will be this one. We might tweak this position slightly later, possibly zooming in a bit, since the resolution of my workspace and video aren't exactly the same. The object might be slightly cut off, so we'll adjust the zoom towards the end. For now, I'll move the cursor to the 6-second mark. I'm at 6:10, so I'll move it back slightly, and then I'll set the camera to its final position. Like this. So I've zoomed in slightly and rotated the camera. My animation timeline is now aligned with my cursor here, but not at the beginning. So I can drag the camera animation bar to extend it to the 0 mark. At this point, I have the beginning of an animation where we can see the camera movement, allowing us to review it simultaneously. But we can also see that the parts currently arrive too early. So we'll adjust them. I'll start with the gear. I can either drag it like this to set it at 2 seconds and 7 frames, or I can right-click on it to apply more precise settings. For example, here I'll select Edit, Start, End, and set it to start at 2.7 and end here. It should last 1 second and 5 frames, so that means ending at 4.2 seconds. Then I'll confirm. I can repeat this process for the other 2 parts. I'll right-click again, select Edit, Start, End, and set it to start at 4 seconds and end at 5 seconds. For the last one, it will start at 4.9 seconds and end at 5.9 seconds. You can see the rhythm picking up gradually, of course. I could adjust these transformations manually by dragging the ends of the animation bars. Now I have a basic animation ready and I can review it. Great. Now I can move on to the next part. Before we dive into the second part of the camera animation, there is an intermediate movement to consider, which is the rotation of this part around their axis. To work on this, I'll pause the camera recording again, allowing me to zoom in on the assembly. Here, these parts have different orientations, so I'll apply rotational transformations by going back to the toolbar. I'll start with these 2 parts first, then the gear, and finally the shaft. So I'll select my first component, then the second one. However, the pivot isn't set to the center, so in the Transform Components function, I'll click on Pivot, which will allow me to select a new pivot centered on the axis. Once you've set the pivot, click to exit the pivot adjustment mode. From here, you can apply the transformation, which in this case will be minus 360. I can see that it has created the initial rotation animation bars for these two parts. I can immediately move my cursor and reposition them slightly to synchronize them. I'll fine-tune the timing afterward. There we go. Now I'll animate the gear and the shaft. I'll go back to the transformation tool, select the gear, and this time I'll apply a 360-degree rotation since its orientation is different from the other parts. And I'm going to do exactly the same for the axis that go through the middle of this gear. So I go back to transformation. Here I'll make the cross since I have my gear, and I'll take my axis on, which I will apply a value of 360. On the Y angle, and more on the Z angle, you can see that these parts don't have the same orientation. I now have 4 animation bars in my timeline. I'll adjust the first one, for example, to start at, let's say, 2 seconds, 210th to 310th after, but in seconds. So here I can right-click and ask for Sketch 2, which is pretty good. And I'll make it last for 2.5 seconds. So we'll end up at 8 seconds and 7/10. We were already doing pretty well, but I'm going to adjust it more precisely. For the others, I can select and enlarge them to reach the same settings. There we go. You can also see that when you do it manually, there are snapping points that appear to synchronize them. And you can always check by right-clicking and selecting Edit Start End to verify the timing. Here we're good. I can check my movement, making sure everything turns in the same direction. Great. I can now move on to my third part. For this, I'll move my cursor further along. I'll begin to around 13 seconds for now. And I'm going to set up my camera and the appearances of my parts. I'll start with the appearances since I'm focused on the assembly part that interests me. To do this, I'll select the 2 arms here that are hidden. And I can either click on the eye again, or I can use the Show Hide tool. From here, if you scroll down your timeline, you'll see light bulbs representing when they're fully visible. You can select and move the timing at any moment. And you can also select the edges of this light bulb to extend the transition. This means that they will appear gradually within this black rectangle's timing. I'm also going to create my camera animation. To do this, I'll reactivate my view here, which will bring me back to my camera's position. I'm going to position myself at 9 seconds. 9 seconds will be the start of my camera movement. It will finish around 12 or 13 seconds. I'll check that right after. So I'll apply my camera movement, which will be a zoom on this assembly. I can zoom in and recenter. Maybe slightly reorient it like this. There we go. And I'll check my camera movement. Now, it may seem long at first, but the timing is right. My camera movement looks good. I've checked it a second time. There, it may be a bit slow, so I'm going to reduce it to 2.5 seconds. So I'll right-click duration and set it to 2.8 seconds instead. There we go. And now I'm going to organize the appearances according to my camera, meaning they will start right after. So they will start at 11 seconds. I can move them and I'll make them appear gradually. And they will have an appearance timing. Let's set it to 1.3 seconds. We'll check right after to see if everything is fine. So this one and the next. There. Then I'll check their placement and slightly overlap them. At this point, I have my animation. I can check it one last time. I could even put it in full screen to check the settings. Here, everything is fine. Very good. And in full screen, I can check according to my resolution. Is my object still in the frame? We see that it's not, but that's normal. I'll just check the intermediate positions. But I would have liked it to be a bit more zoomed out when we get here towards the end of the object so that it's fully visible. So I'm going to slightly adjust my zoom. So now I'll hit escape to go to the end here and slightly zoom out. And I'll do something very similar at the end of my second video. And now I can play it again in full screen to check. If by any chance we're good, which seems to be the case, great. We can now proceed to the final rendering. To do this, I'll hit escape, go to publish, then publish video. I'll change the resolution, for example, to 1980 and hit OK. I can save my animation render and I'll name it V2 so it doesn't overwrite the previous one in AVI format. And now I can save it either in my Fusion project on my computer or both. Here I'm going to save it on the computer. Finally, I'll hit save, which will start the rendering process.